a black entrepreneur, fresh off a cross-country flight after a successful business trip, walks into an airport lounge to relax before heading home. But the moment he enters, an employee targets him with baseless accusations, humiliating him in front of a crowd of onlookers. Within just 10 minutes, the situation takes an unexpected turn, one that leaves the entire lounge stunned and the employee out of a job. What happens next ignites a ripple effect of change that no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story that will challenge the way you see privilege, power, and resilience. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that spark conversation and inspire action. It all started with what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. The sun hung low over the airport, casting long shadows through the glass facade of the terminal. Its golden light spilled across the polished floors, glinting off luggage wheels and the bright brass of the departure gate signs. Gate 12 buzzed with the familiar sounds of modern travel, the drone of announcements, the clatter of bags, and the low hum of strangers who only spoke when necessary. Richard Madison, a man accustomed to moving through life with assured precision, waited near the gate's edge. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, his platinum credit card gleaming momentarily as he slipped it back into his wallet. For Richard, first class was not merely a convenience, it was a declaration. A boundary that set him apart from the rest. It was the result of decades of calculated moves, an earned insulation from the chaos of life. He glanced at his phone, responding to an email without real focus. His thoughts elsewhere. The presentation in Chicago awaited. A room full of executives who, like him, valued sharp suits and firmer handshakes. Yet, something distracted him. A restlessness clawed at the edges of his mind. He chalked it up to the noise around him. The inevitable shuffle of people from different worlds colliding in shared spaces. The announcement for first-class boarding crackled through the speakers, jolting Richard back into motion. He joined the small line, feeling the familiar satisfaction of passing through to where the seats were wide. The champagne cold, and the passengers like him. The gate agent's smile was perfunctory as she scanned his ticket, and he offered her the same in return, stepping into the jet bridge that carried him to his familiar sanctuary. The plane was pristine, its first-class cabin bathed in soft lighting that promised a reprieve from the world outside. Richard took his seat in 2A, placing his briefcase above and settling in with a sigh. He adjusted the armrest, unfolded the in-flight menu, and felt the tension in his shoulders ease. This was his domain. But then, as the other passengers filtered in, the stillness he craved began to unravel. A man approached down the aisle, his stride unhurried, his posture calm. His dark skin seemed to absorb the cabin's muted light, and his modest attire, jeans and a well-worn sweater, stood in contrast to the carefully curated appearances of the other first-class travelers. He carried a single backpack slung over one shoulder, its seams frayed but functional. The man stopped at Richard's row, his gaze flicking briefly to the seat number before he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "This is 2B." Richard stiffened, his mind raced, though outwardly he betrayed nothing but the faintest pause. Surely there had been a mistake. His eyes darted toward the flight attendant, Emma, who stood just a few rows away greeting another passenger. She must have seen it, too. This was not the sort of man one expected to see in first class. Was it? Yes, of course, Richard murmured, shifting slightly to let the man pass. He watched as the man, Marcus, he would later learn, stowed his bag and took his seat with an ease that seemed almost deliberate. Marcus's presence was like a stone dropped into a calm pond, sending ripples outward. Richard could feel the tension in his shoulders return, the quiet question reverberating in his mind: who is he? And what is he doing here? The cabin filled quickly, yet time seemed to slow for Richard. Across the aisle, an older woman with a pearl necklace stole glances at Marcus, her curiosity barely concealed. The tech executive in 1A glanced back once, his brow furrowed slightly before returning to his laptop. Richard could almost hear their thoughts, unspoken but loud in their implications. The codes of exclusivity, those unspoken rules of who belongs where, felt fragile now. teetering under the weight of this man's quiet confidence. Emma appeared, her smile practiced and composed. "Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" she asked. Her voice warm and professional. "Scotch," Richard replied curtly, then hesitated before adding, "Neat." Marcus looked up from the book he had opened. "A biography," Richard noted, though he couldn't make out the subject. "Just water, please," Marcus said, his voice steady, his smile reaching his eyes. Emma returned quickly, placing the drinks on their tray tables with a practiced ease. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do," she said, turning to leave. Richard cleared his throat. "Actually," he said in a low voice, gesturing for Emma to lean closer, "I'd like to speak with you privately. If you don't mind." Emma hesitated, her professional mask slipping for just a moment, revealing a flicker of understanding. Or was it annoyance? "Of course," she said, her tone unwavering. "I'll be right back." As she stepped away, Richard felt the weight of Marcus's presence next to him. Though neither man spoke, the tension was palpable, the silence between them saying more than words ever could. This was not the flight Richard had planned for, and the realization unsettled him. Outwardly, all remained calm in the first-class cabin, but within, the cracks had begun to form, the air thick with an unspoken tension that was as old as the country itself. The plane's engines hummed softly, a low vibration that settled into the bones. The cabin crew moved with the precision of performers on a well-rehearsed stage, offering smiles and drinks as they prepared for departure. But despite the ordinary rhythm of air travel, an invisible weight pressed down on the first-class cabin, an unease that could not be explained by turbulence or delays. Richard Madison sat stiffly in his seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. He didn't know why, but Marcus Gray's presence beside him had unsettled something deep within. It wasn't the man's actions. He had done nothing objectionable. Marcus had even smiled and nodded politely when taking his seat. No, it was something less tangible. Something Richard would struggle to articulate even to himself. It was the quiet challenge to the unspoken rules Richard had grown accustomed to. The way Marcus seemed to occupy the space as if it truly belonged to him. As the flight attendant, Emma returned to address Richard's earlier request. He leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "I need to ask," he began, his tone measured but pointed. "Was there some sort of mix-up with the seating?" "My seatmate," he paused, the hesitation deliberate, as if the words themselves carried more weight than he was willing to admit. "He doesn't seem like the usual first-class passenger." Emma's expression didn't falter, but her posture shifted slightly, her professionalism now tinged with quiet defiance. "There's been no mix-up, sir," she said evenly. "Every passenger in first class is assigned their seat based on their ticket." "Is there an issue I can help you with?" Richard straightened, his face tightening. The question had been polite, but it felt like a challenge. And he wasn't used to being challenged. Especially not here, in this realm of exclusivity. "It's not an issue," he replied curtly. "I just assumed the airline had standards for certain upgrades." The subtle implication hung in the air like smoke. Emma's smile tightened, but she said nothing further, leaving Richard to stew in his discomfort. Beside him, Marcus seemed impervious to the mounting tension. He turned a page in his book, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. Richard stole glances at the man, his mind racing with assumptions. Was he an athlete? A lottery winner? Someone who had lucked into this seat without understanding what it symbolized? The man didn't fit. He was out of place. And yet, he sat there with a calm authority that made Richard's discomfort feel absurd. Even to himself. The woman across the aisle, older, silver-haired, with a string of pearls resting on her blouse, caught Richard's eye. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between pity and judgment. She shifted slightly, tilting her magazine to hide her gaze. But the message was clear. She had noticed. They had all noticed. And yet, no one said a word. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Richard stared out the window, his jaw clenched. He thought of the countless flights he had taken, the ease with which he had claimed this space as his own. But now, a quiet voice nagged at him. A voice he couldn't silence. "Why do you care so much?" It wasn't as though Marcus had intruded. He had purchased his seat, just like everyone else in the cabin. And yet, the sight of him sitting there, reading, of all things, as if he had no awareness of the disruption he caused, felt like an affront. The plane lifted off, climbing steadily above the clouds. The flight attendant returned to offer drinks and snacks. She addressed Marcus first, her tone warmer now, almost pointedly so. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough for Richard to hear. "No, thank you," Marcus replied, his smile polite. He glanced briefly at Richard. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, passing across his face before he returned to his book. Richard's scotch arrived moments later, the glass heavy and cold in his hand. He sipped it, feeling the liquid burn its way down his throat. He should have felt comforted by the ritual, but instead, it only magnified his discomfort. The scotch was a reminder of the privileges he had earned, privileges he now felt slipping, however irrationally, through his fingers. The tension grew heavier as the flight continued. Each interaction between the flight crew and Marcus seemed to underline the absurdity of Richard's unease. The other passengers were watching, though they tried to hide it. Quick glances, whispered conversations that stopped as soon as Richard turned his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were silently judging him. Not Marcus, for the way he bristled in his seat. Even the silence between him and Marcus was damning. It was too calm, too steady, as if Marcus had seen this all before. And maybe he had. Maybe this wasn't the first time he had been looked at this way. Reduced to a symbol of what wasn't supposed to happen. Richard's mind flicked through the possible ways to salvage his dignity. Should he press the issue further with Emma? Should he call the lead flight attendant and demand they fix this? Or should he simply endure, pretending the situation didn't bother him at all? But even as he considered these options, another thought crept in, unwelcome and undeniable. What does it mean if I can't let this go? The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, a low and constant reminder of the shared space they now occupied. For Richard, the space had become a battleground, a quiet, invisible fight for the right to feel at home in a world that, for a moment, didn't feel as safe or as exclusive as it once had. For Marcus, it was something else entirely, though Richard couldn't begin to imagine what. The first-class cabin remained outwardly serene. Drinks were poured, meals were served, and the flight continued its journey. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered, unspoken yet unmistakable, building toward a confrontation neither man fully understood, but both knew was inevitable. The flight had settled into its rhythm, a symphony of white noise, the hum of the engines, the clink of ice against glasses, the soft murmur of voices from the rows ahead. Yet for Richard Madison, each sound felt amplified, distorted, as though the very air around him carried a charge he couldn't ignore. The presence of Marcus Gray, calm and assured in his seat, was no longer just an irritant. It was an indictment, silent but unrelenting. Richard stared straight ahead, gripping his scotch glass as though it were an anchor. He told himself it wasn't about race. Not really, but the words rang hollow in his mind. If it wasn't about race, why couldn't he let it go? Why did he feel so keenly the boundary that Marcus's presence had crossed? A boundary Richard himself had drawn long ago, though never with words? Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman with the pearls had lowered her magazine, her gaze now openly fixed on the two men. Richard caught her eye for a fleeting moment. Her expression was inscrutable, a flicker of judgment, perhaps, or a subtle encouragement to say something. Do something, to restore the equilibrium that had been disrupted. But what equilibrium? And whose? The first real challenge came in the form of Emma, the flight attendant, returning with meal options. Her voice carried its usual professional cadence. But there was an undeniable warmth when she turned to Marcus. "Would you like chicken or vegetarian pasta, sir?" she asked, her tone light and conversational. "The chicken, please," Marcus replied, offering a polite smile. He paused, then added, "Thank you for your service. I know flights can't always be easy." Emma's smile widened, the kind that wasn't just for show. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." When she turned to Richard, the warmth cooled noticeably. "And for you, sir?" "The chicken," Richard muttered. His voice sounded sharper than he intended. and he felt the woman across the aisle shift in her seat. Her disapproval was almost palpable, pressing against him like a physical weight. As Emma moved on, Richard felt a prickle of resentment. Was it him? Or had she been deliberately kinder to Marcus? Did she think Richard didn't notice? Or worse, did she think he didn't deserve the same courtesy? He glanced at Marcus, who had already returned to his book. The man seemed utterly unfazed by the exchange. But that only made it worse. It was as if he knew something Richard didn't. As if he had already won a battle Richard hadn't realized they were fighting. The second challenge came when Marcus, after finishing his meal, turned to Richard for the first time. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but direct. "Could I trouble you for the salt?" Richard froze. The request was innocuous, polite, even friendly, yet it felt like a provocation. A deliberate crossing of an invisible line. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, pretending he hadn't heard, but the weight of the woman's gaze across the aisle, the subtle tilt of her head as she watched, made that impossible. "Of course," Richard said tightly, reaching for the salt shaker with a hand that felt suddenly heavy. He passed it to Marcus without meeting his eyes, his fingers brushing against the other man's for the briefest second. "Thank you," Marcus said, his tone neutral, offering no further opening for conversation. Richard nodded stiffly, turning back to his meal. But the moment lingered, reverberating in his mind. It was such a small thing. Yet it felt monumental, a test he hadn't known he was taking, and one he wasn't sure he had passed. By the time the third challenge arrived, the tension in the cabin had become almost unbearable. It began with a slight turbulence, the plane shuddering as it passed through a patch of rough air. The passengers around them reacted in the usual ways, some gripping their armrests, others glancing anxiously at the flight attendants. Richard felt his own pulse quicken, though he tried to mask it with a sip of scotch. Marcus, however, remained completely composed. He closed his book, marking his place with care, and folded his hands in his lap. His calmness was maddening. It was as though he was saying, without saying it, "This doesn't bother me. Why does it bother you?" The turbulence passed quickly, but it left behind a charged silence. Richard, unable to resist the urge any longer, turned to Marcus. "You seem awfully calm," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "Turbulence doesn't bother you?" Marcus looked at him, his expression measured. "I've been through worse," he said simply. There was no malice in his voice, no challenge, but the words struck Richard like a blow. It wasn't just about the turbulence. Richard realized, it was about everything. The ease with which Marcus navigated the world, despite the barriers Richard knew must have been placed in his path, felt like a mirror held up to his own discomfort. And Richard didn't like what he saw. As the plane steadied and the cabin returned to its usual rhythm, Richard found himself retreating further into his seat. The questions in his mind grew louder, more insistent. Why did this man, with his quiet confidence and unshakable composure, unsettle him so deeply? Why did Marcus's very presence feel like a challenge to the world Richard had built for himself? The answer, though unspoken, lingered in the air between them, because Marcus belonged. And Richard was beginning to realize that the boundaries he had spent his life reinforcing were illusions, fragile and meaningless in the face of someone who refused to acknowledge them. The noise of the plane was soft, almost soothing, but within Richard's mind, the quiet noise of confrontation grew louder with every passing moment. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition into the quiet mid-flight hours. Outside the windows, the world had vanished into a dark expanse, leaving the passengers suspended in a steel vessel, cut off from everything except one another. For Richard Madison, the world felt even smaller than the confines of the first-class cabin. The walls were pressing in, and every glance from the other passengers felt like a silent accusation. Marcus Gray remained beside him, quiet and composed. His book now rested in the seat pocket in front of him, replaced by a small notebook in which he occasionally jotted down notes. His calm was a rebuke to Richard's restlessness, a silent commentary on the churning discomfort that Richard could no longer contain. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman with the pearls had put her magazine aside. Her gaze, though less obvious now, lingered. Behind her, A man in his 40s, casually dressed but carrying the air of authority, glanced at Richard and then at Marcus. The shift in the cabin's mood was subtle, but Richard felt it like a physical force. A growing solidarity with Marcus that left him feeling increasingly isolated. The first overt challenge came when Emma, the flight attendant, returned with the beverage cart. Her smile was warm as she approached Marcus. "Would you like another drink, sir?" she asked. "Yes, please," Marcus said, his voice easy and polite. "Just water." Emma poured the water with care, her movements deliberate. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to carry only to Marcus. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask," she said. Her tone was genuine, almost conspiratorial, as though she understood something unspoken and wanted Marcus to know he wasn't alone. When Emma turned to Richard, her smile cooled, her posture straightened. "And for you, sir?" she asked. Richard hesitated. Her tone was polite, but the difference was clear. "Another scotch," he said shortly. The words clipped. Emma nodded, pouring the drink with precision. She said nothing more, but the space between them felt charged, her silence heavier than words. The second challenge came not long after. When the turbulence returned, stronger this time, the plane jolted violently, eliciting gasps from several passengers. The older woman across the aisle clutched her armrest, her pearls swinging slightly with the motion. Richard instinctively grabbed his own armrests, his heart pounding as the plane rattled. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Marcus, however, remained still. He closed his notebook and tucked it into the seat pocket, then folded his hands in his lap. His expression was calm, his breathing steady. It was as though the chaos around him had no power to reach him. Richard couldn't help but notice. "You're awfully calm," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His voice was tight, edged with both curiosity and irritation. Marcus turned to him, his gaze steady. "I've been through worse," he said simply. The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that Richard couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the turbulence. And they both knew it. Marcus wasn't speaking about the plane. Not entirely. He was speaking about a lifetime of navigating spaces where he wasn't expected, wasn't welcomed, yet refused to yield. The final challenge of the chapter came when another passenger, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit seated a few rows ahead, stood and turned to Marcus. His voice carried across the cabin, breaking the fragile silence. "Excuse me," he said, his tone hesitant but firm. "I couldn't help but notice your book earlier. Leadership, was it?" Marcus looked up, meeting the man's gaze. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "I'm in corporate management," the man continued. "We've been discussing diversity initiatives in my company. It's a challenging space, you know, but seeing someone like you, it's inspiring." The cabin went silent. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the well-meaning but clumsy attempt at acknowledgement. "Thank you," Marcus said after a pause. His tone was measured, his words careful. "It's important work." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The interaction felt like a spotlight on everything he hadn't said, everything he couldn't say. The other passengers were watching now, their gazes darting between Marcus, the man, and Richard himself. The boundaries Richard had relied on for so long, the unspoken codes of exclusivity and belonging, were crumbling before his eyes. As the turbulence subsided and the plane settled once more, Richard found himself staring at the untouched presentation folder on his lap. The graphs and charts within suddenly felt meaningless, trivial in the face of what was unfolding around him. He had always thought of himself as someone who understood the world, someone who had earned his place in it through hard work and determination. But now, he was beginning to see the cracks in that narrative, the ways in which his comfort had been built on assumptions he had never questioned. Beside him, Marcus opened his book again, turning the page with deliberate care. His calm presence was a reminder of the larger story playing out, one that had begun long before this flight and would continue long after it landed. For Richard, the flight had become a crucible, a space where the unspoken tensions of a lifetime were being laid bare. The cabin's quiet returned, but it was no longer the same. The silence carried weight now. A reminder of the invisible boundaries that divided people. Even in the seemingly neutral space of a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. The plane hummed on, steady and unyielding, but within the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Each passing moment seemed to deepen the invisible divides, the subtle tensions growing sharper, like a taut string about to snap. Richard Madison sat rigid in his seat, his thoughts a tangled knot of frustration and unease. It wasn't just the presence of Marcus Gray beside him that gnawed at him. It was the way everyone else seemed to notice, to see through him, as if his carefully constructed armor had been stripped away. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman watched him again, her gaze no longer subtle. She didn't try to hide her disapproval now, it was written plainly across her face. Further down the row, the man in the suit who had spoken to Marcus earlier had resumed his conversation, his voice carrying just enough for Richard to hear. "You know," the man said, "I've been thinking a lot about how companies can create more inclusive spaces. It's not just about diversity, it's about making people feel like they belong." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Belonging is key," he said. "Diversity without inclusion is just optics. It's the feeling of being welcomed, truly welcomed, that makes the difference." Richard stiffened. The words, though not directed at him, struck with precision. His discomfort wasn't just about Marcus's presence, it was about the way that presence had reshaped the space around them, forcing Richard to confront his own assumptions. Marcus belonged here, that much was clear to everyone except, perhaps, Richard himself. The first fissure came when Emma, the flight attendant, returned to Marcus's row. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft but audible. "Sir, I just wanted to let you know that we appreciate your patience today." Richard bristled. Patience? For what? Marcus hadn't been inconvenienced. Not that Richard could see. If anything, it was Richard who had endured the discomfort of a flight that had gone entirely off script. "Thank you," Marcus replied. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength in it, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension that hung between them. Emma turned to Richard next. Her professionalism remained intact, but the warmth she had shown Marcus was noticeably absent. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked. "No," Richard said curtly. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Emma, as though daring her to acknowledge the disparity. She didn't. Instead, she moved on, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. The next crack in the facade came when a young woman seated a few rows back walked toward the restroom. On her way, she paused briefly beside Marcus's seat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but purposeful. "I just wanted to say that I really admire how you've handled everything today." Marcus looked up, his expression neutral. "Thank you," he said simply. The woman glanced at Richard then, her gaze sharp, almost challenging. She didn't say anything more, but her meaning was clear. Richard felt the heat rise in his face, his frustration mounting. Was everyone against him now? The turbulence returned, this time accompanied by an announcement from the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a bit of a bumpy ride for the next 20 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane jolted violently, and the cabin filled with uneasy murmurs. Richard gripped his armrests, his knuckles white. The turbulence mirrored the growing storm inside him. The feeling of losing control, of being exposed in ways he didn't fully understand. Marcus, meanwhile, remained steady. He closed his book and rested his hands lightly on his lap, his calmness a stark contrast to the chaos around him. Richard stole a glance at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. Marcus didn't look away, his gaze steady but unreadable. Richard broke the connection, turning back to the window. He told himself it was the turbulence that bothered him. But he knew better. It was the way Marcus seemed to exist so effortlessly in a space that Richard had claimed as his own. It was the realization that Marcus's calm wasn't defiance. It was certainty, the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth, regardless of what others thought. The fault line widened further when Marcus spoke again, this time addressing Richard directly. "You know," he said, his tone conversational but deliberate. Spaces like this aren't about who deserves to be here. They're about who's willing to claim them. Richard turned to him, caught off guard. What do you mean? He asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. Belonging isn't something people give you, he said. It's something you take. But taking it means you have to be willing to deal with people who think you don't deserve it. Richard felt the words land like a blow. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was too clear. Marcus wasn't talking about himself. Not entirely. He was talking about Richard. About the assumptions Richard had carried into this cabin. About the way those assumptions had been upended by Marcus's quiet presence. The turbulence eased, and the cabin settled once more. But for Richard, there was no settling, no return to the easy confidence he had felt at the start of the flight. The space around him had shifted irrevocably, the fault line now fully exposed. He stared out the window. The dark expanse beyond a mirror of the uncertainty within. For the first time in years, Richard Madison didn't feel in control. And for the first time, he wondered if that might be the point. The turbulence passed, but the unease it left behind lingered. The cabin lights dimmed further, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow aisle. The plane felt quieter now, though not in the comforting way Richard Madison was used to on these late-night flights. This was a quiet charge with tension, a silence thick with unspoken words. The air between him and Marcus Gray seemed alive with it, pressing on Richard like a weight he couldn't shift. He sipped his scotch, though it no longer offered the relief he sought. Instead, it burned his throat, a sharp reminder of how far this flight had spiraled beyond his control. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman had given up on pretense entirely. She watched him openly now, her expression a mixture of pity and judgment. And then came the sound. A deliberate clearing of the throat. It came from the man seated directly in front of Marcus. The one who had earlier engaged him about leadership. This time, his voice carried more purpose, rising above the subdued hum of the engines. "Excuse me," the man said, twisting slightly in his seat to face Marcus. "I couldn't help overhearing earlier. You mentioned belonging. That's powerful. I'd like to hear more." Marcus, who had been resting his hands lightly on his closed book, met the man's gaze with calm clarity. "Belonging is about more than fitting in," he said. His voice was measured, deliberate. "It's about knowing you have a right to be somewhere, even if others question it." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been working on a project. Diversity training for my company. I think we need more of that perspective." Marcus offered a small, polite smile. "It's an important conversation," he said, "but it's not just about training. It's about recognizing the structures that make people feel excluded in the first place." Richard's grip tightened on his glass. The words landed hard, not because they were unfamiliar but because they rang with a truth he couldn't deny. The structures Marcus spoke of weren't abstract, they were the very ones Richard had benefited from all his life. The conversation expanded, drawing others in. A young woman seated a few rows back chimed in, her voice soft but insistent. "It's not just companies," she said. "It's everywhere. Schools, neighborhoods, even flights like this." Her words rippled through the cabin, stirring something Richard couldn't quite name. He wanted to dismiss her, to call her naive, but the sincerity in her voice made that impossible. "I've always thought," Marcus began, "that real change starts in the small moments. The ones where people have a choice. To speak up, or stay silent. To welcome someone, or turn them away." The silver-haired woman across the aisle nodded, her pearls catching the dim light. "That's true," she said, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "But it takes courage, doesn't it, to confront those moments?" Richard felt his pulse quicken. The conversation was no longer contained, it had spilled into the space around him. Surrounding him like water rising slowly but steadily. He glanced at Marcus, who now held the room's attention with effortless grace. "You make it sound simple," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the discussion. He hadn't intended to speak, but the words had forced themselves out. "But it's not, is it? It's messy. People aren't perfect. Systems aren't perfect." The cabin went still. All eyes turned to him, waiting. For the first time in years, Richard felt exposed, vulnerable under their gaze. Marcus regarded him steadily, his expression unreadable. "No, it's not simple," he said after a pause. "But it's necessary. And it starts with recognizing when the messiness is something you've been complicit in." The words landed like a hammer blow, and Richard felt his breath catch. He opened his mouth to respond but found he had nothing to say. The silence that followed was deafening. As the conversation shifted, Richard found himself retreating inward, the weight of Marcus's words settling into him like stones. He thought of his career, the endless hours spent climbing the corporate ladder, the pride he had taken in his achievements. But now, he saw those achievements in a different light, not as monuments to hard work, but as markers of a system that had always tilted in his favor. The fault line he had felt earlier was no longer just beneath him. It had fractured wide open, leaving him teetering on the edge of an uncomfortable truth. He had spent his life guarding a space he had never truly earned, defending boundaries that had no real meaning. And now, sitting beside Marcus Gray, whose presence had quietly dismantled those boundaries with nothing more than his calm, assured existence, Richard realized he was no longer sure who he was without them. The plane hit another small patch of turbulence, jolting Richard back to the present. Marcus, unfazed, turned another page in his notebook, the sound of the paper rustling unnervingly loud in the silence. For a moment, Richard wondered what Marcus was writing, what thoughts he was capturing about this flight, this encounter. He wanted to ask but didn't. Instead, he stared out the window, the dark expanse below reflecting the growing void within. The cabin was quiet, save for the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses as the flight attendants cleared the remnants of dinner. The low light cast a muted glow over the passengers, who now seemed less engaged in their usual routines and more attuned to the unspoken drama that had been unfolding since takeoff. Richard Madison sat stiffly in his seat, his drink untouched, his mind churning. The turbulence outside the plane had long since settled, but inside, it raged on, quiet but relentless. His gaze flicked to Marcus Gray, seated beside him, who remained an enigma, a man whose very presence seemed to have cracked open something fragile and uncomfortable in Richard's carefully ordered world. Marcus was writing again, his pen moving steadily across the pages of his notebook. The sound of pen on paper was soft but insistent, a rhythmic reminder of the narrative Richard could neither control nor understand. He couldn't help but wonder what Marcus was writing. About this flight. About him. The thought was unbearable. The first challenge came when the silver-haired woman across the aisle spoke up again. Her voice clear and deliberate. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Marcus. "I couldn't help but overhear your earlier conversation about belonging. It struck a chord with me." Marcus looked up, his expression open, curious. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his tone warm but measured. The woman leaned forward slightly, her pearls catching the light. "I grew up in a different time," she admitted. "There were places I was told I didn't belong. Because I was a woman. Because I didn't fit the mold of what success was supposed to look like." "It's different, I know, but your words reminded me of those struggles." Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not so different," he said. "The systems might look different, but the message is often the same. You don't belong here. And the work is the same too. To push back against that message. To claim the space anyway." The woman smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. "It's exhausting, though, isn't it?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, then said, "It is, but it's also necessary." Richard shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. He felt the conversation pulling at him, forcing him to confront truths he wasn't ready to face. The woman's admission, Marcus's calm affirmation. It all felt too personal, too close. The second challenge came moments later, when another voice joined the conversation. This time, it was a young man seated in the row behind Richard. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression earnest. "I think about this a lot," the young man said, "about how people like me, people who look like me, benefit from these systems, even when we don't mean to." His words hung in the air, and Richard felt them like a slap. The young man didn't look directly at him, but he might as well have. His confession was Richard's own, spoken aloud by someone braver than he was. "It's not about guilt," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "It's about responsibility. Once you see the system for what it is, the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The young man nodded slowly, as if weighing the words. "I guess that's the hard part, isn't it?" he said, figuring out what to do. Marcus smiled faintly. "It's hard," he agreed, "but it starts with listening, with being willing to sit in discomfort." Richard's jaw tightened. The words felt pointed, even though he knew they weren't meant for him alone. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. He was too aware of the eyes around him, the silent judgment he felt radiating from every corner of the cabin. The third and final challenge came when Emma, the flight attendant, returned. She moved through the cabin with practiced ease, checking on passengers and collecting empty glasses. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused, her expression softening. "Is there anything else I can get you, sir?" she asked, her voice warm. "No, thank you," Marcus replied. "I appreciate your kindness." Emma smiled, and for a moment, the tension in the cabin seemed to ease. But then she turned to Richard, her smile fading slightly, her tone cooling. "And for you, sir?" she asked. Richard hesitated. He wanted to say something. Anything that would reassert his place, his authority, but all he could manage was a curt "No." Emma nodded and moved on, leaving Richard alone with the silence that now felt deafening. He glanced at Marcus, who had returned to his writing, his movements unhurried, his presence unshaken. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, the cabin had grown still. The earlier conversations had subsided, leaving behind a charged silence. Richard stared out the window, watching the city lights come into view, their glow reflecting off the dark surface of Lake Michigan. He thought about the presentation waiting for him in Chicago, the room full of colleagues who would expect him to lead with confidence and authority. He thought about the life he had built, the spaces he had claimed as his own, and he thought about Marcus, whose quiet dignity had disrupted all of it. For the first time, Richard wondered if the disruption wasn't the problem, but the point. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skimming the runway before settling with a soft thud. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, Richard remained seated, his hands gripping the armrests. He wasn't ready to face the world outside. Not yet. Beside him, Marcus stood, retrieving his bag from the overhead compartment with the same calm deliberation he had shown throughout the flight. He turned to Richard, meeting his gaze for a moment that felt both brief and eternal. "Take care," Marcus said simply, his voice steady, and then he was gone, leaving Richard alone in a cabin that suddenly felt too large, too empty, and far too quiet. The terminal was bustling, alive with the chaotic energy of arrivals and departures. People rushed past Richard Madison, their suitcases rattling against the tiled floor, their voices blending into a steady hum. But Richard felt frozen, standing just beyond the gate, clutching his briefcase as though it might ground him in a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. Marcus Gray was gone, disappearing into the stream of passengers heading toward baggage claim or connecting flights. Richard's eyes lingered on the spot where Marcus had stood moments ago, the memory of his steady gaze still fresh. "Take care," Marcus had said. The words echoed in Richard's mind, not as a farewell but as a challenge. A quiet, deliberate invitation to do something he had spent years avoiding, confront himself. The first challenge came as Richard approached the car service counter, where a line had already formed. The man in front of him, middle-aged, in a crisp suit, was deep in conversation with another passenger about the flight. Their voices were low, but Richard couldn't help but overhear. "I've never seen anything like it," the man said, shaking his head. The way that gentleman handled himself, it was remarkable. And the other guy, his voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The other passenger, a younger woman, nodded. It was so obvious, wasn't it? The discomfort, the entitlement. "I mean, it's 2024. How do people still think that way?" Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to step forward, to demand they say his name outright, to defend himself, but he couldn't. He knew they were right. Worse. He knew they weren't just talking about the man he had been on that flight. They were talking about the man he had been his entire life. The second challenge came in the back seat of the car that whisked him to his downtown hotel. As the city lights blurred past the window, Richard found himself pulling out his phone. Almost instinctively, he scrolled through emails, social media, anything to distract himself. But distraction was impossible. A notification caught his eye. A LinkedIn post from a colleague in Chicago. The post featured a blurry photo taken on the flight. A side profile of Marcus. Notebook in hand, his expression serene. The caption read, "Witnessed something incredible today. A masterclass in grace and dignity at 35,000 feet. Inspired to do better. #leadership #inclusion. The post had hundreds of likes. Dozens of comments. Each one a testament to the impact Marcus had made in just a few short hours. Richard's stomach churned. He wanted to click away. To ignore it. But his thumb hesitated over the screen. One comment stood out. A simple sentence that cut through the noise. "It's not enough to admire. What will you do next?" The third and final challenge came that night. As Richard sat alone in his hotel room, staring at his laptop. His presentation materials were spread out on the desk. A sea of charts and graphs meant to illustrate market trends and projected growth. But the numbers felt meaningless now. Empty in the face of the questions that had followed him off the plane. He opened a blank email. His fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a long moment, he just sat there, the cursor blinking accusingly. Then, finally, he began to type. Subject: acknowledgement and reflection. Dear Mr. Gray, I hope this message finds you well. I don't know if you'll remember me from our flight earlier today. But I felt compelled to reach out. First, I want to offer my sincerest apologies. My behavior on that flight was unacceptable. Toward you, toward the crew, and toward everyone else who bore witness to it. I let my assumptions and prejudices guide my actions. And for that, I am deeply sorry. You don't owe me forgiveness. But I owe you this acknowledgement. Your presence challenged me in ways I didn't expect. And it forced me to confront parts of myself I've long ignored. I'm grateful for that, even as it unsettles me. I know words alone aren't enough. What I do next will matter more than anything I could say here. But I wanted to start with this. An honest admission of my failings. And a commitment to doing better. Thank you for your patience, your grace, and your example. Sincerely, Richard Madison. The words sat on the screen. Stark and raw. Richard reread them, his heart pounding, then hit send before he could second-guess himself. The morning after the flight, Richard stood in front of a room full of colleagues, delivering the presentation he had once believed would define his trip. He spoke about numbers, trends, and opportunities, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. His mind was elsewhere, still replaying the conversations from the plane. The faces of the passengers who had witnessed his unraveling. The quiet strength of Marcus Gray. As the meeting concluded, Richard lingered behind, watching his colleagues file out. One stayed behind, a younger associate who had been with the company only a year. She approached him cautiously, her expression curious. "Mr. Madison," she said, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, unsure of what was coming. "I heard about what happened on your flight," she said, her voice careful. "It's all over social media. But what I really want to know is, what did you learn?" Richard opened his mouth to respond. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an easy answer. What had he learned? He wasn't sure yet, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. Back in his hotel room that evening, Richard received a reply to his email. It was short but powerful. Subject: acknowledgement and reflection. Dear Mr. Madison, I appreciate your message and the thought you've put into it. Change begins with acknowledgement, and you've taken an important first step. I hope you continue on this path. Take care. Marcus Gray. Richard read the email twice. Then a third time. It wasn't an absolution. It wasn't meant to be. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The quiet truth of the flight had fractured his old assumptions. But in their place, something new was forming. A possibility. Fragile yet undeniable. For something better.